Hi, good morning, everybody. It's Mary Rowe. It's lunchtime on the East Coast. In Central Canada, it's a little past lunchtime on the East Coast, and it's just breakfast time or morning coffee in Vancouver. We're very, and I shouldn't ignore the Mountain Zone. The Mountain Zone are having a high tea, maybe. Not high tea, they're having mid-morning tea. We're happy to have you here on City Talk. We're doing a series of sessions across all the different topics of urbanism and what is the impact of COVID on cities and on urban life, both now and in the future. I'm Mary Rowe, the president of CUI, and we're in the connective tissue business. We're about creating these kinds of opportunities for us to learn from one another, adapt quickly, hear what everyone's trying, and see if we can adapt as effectively as we can. That's why we put up CitywatchCanada.ca, which is monitoring municipal government action. Then we put up CityshareCanada.ca, which is remarkable examples from across the country of communities responding in different kinds of ways, all sorts of innovation, hundreds of examples there. And now we're doing City Talk Canada, which is how we make sense of this, how do we create some meaning, and what are the implications as we go forward. This is are to be candid conversations, and so people participate here as individuals. They may have clients, they may have employers, they may have institutions that they're working with, but they really are here speaking as individuals, and we're appreciative that they take the time to do that and that they feel comfortable doing that. So we want to have real talk here, candid conversations. This CUI team, part of us, reside here in Toronto, and so we always start by just acknowledging the land in which we are in Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we're now home to many, many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people from across Turtle Island. We also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Anishinaabeg nations. We have participants today on the panel here who come from different places and have different territorial ancestry. And then we have lots and lots of folks on the chat who will sign in from various parts across the country. And we're also having international people coming in. Just to draw participants' attention to the chat function, you'll see that there is a chat function where you can participate in the conversation, and we would encourage you to direct your comments not to just all panelists. You'll see you have a little toggle switch there. You can go to all panelists and everyone. We'd prefer you say everyone, because often the answer to your question will be answered by somebody in the chat, not necessarily on the panel here. So, and as we say about these chat functions, we glean a lot from these. So we're really keen for people to add whatever they can here. You'll also see detailed bios for each of the participants there. You'll see links to where you can find out more information about them, because I'm not going to read their biographies, but you can check that out. And when you put something up on the chat, it lives a long time. So just be aware that what goes on the chat is going to not only stay in the chat, but it might appear on our website, because we do summaries of the chats because they've been so rich. When we have these conversations, we continue to be really cognizant that while we're trying to make sense of what COVID is doing to all of our lives, there are thousands and thousands of Canadians still engaged in frontline work, saving lives, coping with extraordinary challenge and emergency situations. And we don't want these conversations to be seen as a replacement for that, or supplanting or interfering with that at all. We acknowledge that many, many, many folks are still engaged in that kind of on the ground life and death recovery. And we keep that in our minds as we talk about these conversations going forward. We are trying to make these conversations very focused on what's practical things. So each of you has been invited because you're engaged in work that has a tangible, practical application in your day-to-day work, and how is COVID impacting that. So we're really focusing on what's working, what's not, and what's next. And we appreciate that a lot of things that were challenging to us in urban life pre-COVID are now made much worse, they're much clearer what the challenges are. So we appreciate having a session on youth and on what is going on in terms of the ways in which cities include or exclude or younger people. And of course, you are inheriting this built environment that others have designed and built and have lived in. And this is an interesting moment for you as a generation of leaders to think about how are you going to take this crisis and move it to the next phase. How do we learn? You know, previous pandemics have informed all sorts of really important public policy changes and different ways in which we've done things in urban environments. So it's kind of up to you folks to figure out, well, what is this one going to mean? So this is just the beginning of a conversation. We continue, the chat function stays open up a bit after the hour. So if people want to continue, they can continue to engage there. And also you can have a conversation on social media with #CityTalk. And tell us what you're seeing, and tell us what your observations are, and what kinds of thinking and actions this conversation may trigger for you, because we want to have this to continue to be a really rich engagement. We also are trying to make sure that these programs are extraordinarily popular, and we appreciate so many people coming in, and we know that you have other topics you want us to address. So please, you'll see in the chat box periodically, Emily will post a link to our evaluation mechanism, and you can tell us what you're liking or what you don't, or what other topics you think we should be tackling, and that would be great. Let me just see if there's anything else that I need to just address from my little crib notes. I think that might be it. So hashtag, oh yes, that's right. They've just responded, they've added one more thing. So City Talk, City Watch, and City Share all have been produced by some CUI staff and then a gazillion volunteers and partner organizations across the country who are, and certainly when we were putting these up, these were being done in the middle of the night, all hands on deck moment. And they continue to be populated and serviced by volunteers who take an hour, half an hour, or whatever they've got in their day to track what's going on with the municipal government, or track examples in their community that they're seeing that they think should be highlighted and shared across the country. So if you would like to do that and help us, and you've got some bandwidth, we would be very, very appreciative. And so you just need to email covidresponse@canurb.org, and have we got a task or 2 or 5 for you? So we'd love to have you part of it. And as we suggested, it's all about connective tissue and building that understanding and how we in Urban Canada are responding. So covidresponse@canurb.org. All right, so youth. Let's talk about this really critical topic. I can see Michael's excited. He's getting ready. So here's who we have joining us from, I don't know how they appear on the screen to everybody else, but I can do it the way they appear for me. So Myran is with us from Future Majority. You want to wave, Aaron, so they know it's you? And that's Aaron. And Linxi Mytkolli from Youthful Cities. Linxi, you want to wave? Thank you. And then Michael Redhead Champagne, who's in Winnipeg. I actually wasn't identifying where people were. There's, yeah, that you can figure which one is Michael. Aaron's in Toronto, Lindsay's in Toronto, Michael's in Winnipeg, where it's either blizzards or mosquitoes. We'll find out in a second. And then Veronika Bylicki, who's with CityHive. She's in Vancouver. There you go, a nice little Vancouver small, and just getting warmed up over there in Vancouver this morning. And then the last one is González Guerrero at Youth Climate Labs, who has a very impressive sticky note board back there. I want to know what's on that. That makes me tired just looking at that bulletin board behind you. Who's I think in Ottawa. So again, really, really pleased to have you folks here. Let's go to the furthest away from Toronto. Let's go first to Vancouver and hear. Tell us a little bit, if you can, Veronika, about CityHive. What was going on in your life before COVID in terms of your work? And then tell us a little bit about what you're observing during COVID. Okay, so we're all ears, and everybody's going to have a couple minutes to have a go, and then we're going to have a big free-for-all conversation. So over to you.
Certainly. Thanks, and thanks so much for having me. And yes, I'm joining from Vancouver, also the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and so feeling really grateful to be on these lands and definitely holding that in this conversation and in all of the work that we do. So CityHive, what we do is, our mission is to transform the way that young people are engaged in shaping our cities. And so pre-COVID, it's tough to go all the way back to the beginning of March or February, but pre-COVID and in general.
It feels kind of like a year ago, doesn't it? No, there's sort of like COVID time. It feels, I know what you mean. Days start to feel like weeks, don't they?
Yeah, they do. A year ago or maybe 10 years ago, yeah. But yeah, what we do is we really work on building bridges between civic institutions and younger folks. And the way that we do that in particular is through building civic literacy. So the reason why we exist is that my co-founder Teska and I found that whenever we went to any open houses for community consultations, at a city council meeting, any decision-making table, there are many voices that are missing, and younger voices were often one of the most prevalent that we're missing. And so to bridge that gap, we really work on building civic literacy, so understanding how these messy, complex civic institutions actually work, how rezoning works, how housing policy works, and also really work on building capacity and connections among youth with decision makers and community leaders and organizations. And so that trend still continues throughout COVID. That's very much how we see our role is as a bridge. And I think one of the ways that we're adapting to COVID is we run several different programs, and a lot of our projects and on the ground engagement work, of course, is shifted and isn't in person anymore, but we have several civic education programs, and those are offered online, and we're actually just launching a program now that's all focused on understanding resilience, so what it means to have a resilient community in terms of democratic, local, social, and economic resilience. And we've also launched a series with the SFU Center for Dialogue in Public Square called Distance Not Disengage, that's holding conversations on different themes weekly and still convening folks to talk about important issues. And I think that's also all of that to say that we recognize we're, you know, not a frontline organization, and so I think we're trying to figure out what our most important role to be playing right now is. And to touch on what I'm seeing, I think yeah, we could have a whole conversation that's just about the impacts that youth are feeling, and I think also recognizing that youth aren't a homogeneous category, that there is that COVID is having really profound disproportionate impacts on different populations, and that's the same for different populations of youth, thinking about youth that are homeless, that are in unsafe housing situations, that are aging out of care. And so I think it's important to hold that too. And so, of course, a lot of financial precarity across the board, loss of jobs, and I think just a lot of challenges in not loopholes, but gaps that I think are existing within the different support mechanisms that we're seeing. But I think we're also seeing really incredible and powerful organizing. Our local largest mutual aid network called Coming Together Vancouver. It's now a Facebook group with over 34,000 people, I think, when I last checked. Yeah. And it's practically all convened and run by youth organizers, a lot of youth organizers from the climate movement who came together right away and have been so talented at responding and building that network. And so I think we're seeing a lot of examples like that too, and really creative and innovative solutions that I hope that we can continue to hold youth in those conversations as we're building solutions going forward. And I think the last thing I'll say is I think we're also really seeing a kind of return to the hyper local. And I think with that example in particular, a lot of folks that might have been organizing around climate or these larger issues are now focusing on, you know, what can I do on my block? What can I do in my building? And I think that's really incredible to be seeing that sort of social cohesion build. And I'm really curious about what that'll also look like going forward. Maybe a few more thoughts, but maybe I'll end there.
Yeah, well, you raised a lot of things. I just want to remind people on the chat to change your toggle switch to not just all panelists, but all panelists and attendees. You've got a little switch there so that everybody can see what you're saying. That's great. Interesting what you're suggesting around civic literacy, Veronika. Like I would have thought that civic literacy was an issue for everybody, regardless of age, although you're zeroing in specifically on youth and younger people, eh?
Mm-hmm, yeah, and I absolutely agree that civic literacy is a challenge across the board. But I think when we look at who shows up to city council meetings, for example, usually older folks, people who perhaps feel like they have more of a stake, own a home, are the ones who show up. And so I think the way that we're bridging that is really making sure that that younger folks know that those spaces are meant for them. I think,
Yeah.
So many people don't even know that City Hall is a public building. And so I think, making sure that people understand that our elected representatives are working for us, and really know how to access those decision-making spaces.
Yeah, I hear you, and as you suggest, and I also appreciate your point that this tendency that we have to kind of lump everybody together. Well, young people feel this way, or youth. It's sort of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, it's as diverse as any other subset, right? And when we were putting this session together, we had that whole conversation about, well, do we want to just sort of pigeonhole? Oh, there's a youth session versus let's put younger people on the platform here to talk about what do you see as the issues that are pressing, not just for young people, just generally, what's your perspective? So, okay, well, let's now go to Toronto, to Linxi. Let's talk a little bit about how what you were seeing or what your focus has been, and now some COVID stuff. And we're going to come back to general topics because Veronica's put a bunch on the table. I kept the list, and why don't you tell us a little bit about you, Linxi?
Yeah, so Youthful Cities is a social enterprise. We've been working with young people, so 18 to 30-ish, in cities across Canada, but also globally, on how to make their cities better places to live, work, and play. And pre-COVID, we did this through research programs, but also dialogue-based programs. One of the most immediate impacts for us was all these amazing programs that we had lined up that relied on in-person convening, and the power that comes out from like bringing different diverse sets of youth together to speak about these issues, that doesn't exist anymore. So that was, of course, the first immediate impact. What we've noticed is pre-COVID, we were doing a lot of stuff on the future of work for young people in Canadian cities. And now the idea of the future of work post-COVID is just completely up in the air for young folks. And one challenge that we've been facing is we saw this really drastic rise in unemployment for young people in Canada in a matter of a week. And we understand that that's because young folks are actually overrepresented in a lot of the service industries and the other industries that face the first wave of layoffs when it came to COVID. So we started to look to hire youth, to do some research on what are these socioeconomic impacts, how can we better understand what folks are needing employment and future of work-wise. And one thing that became incredibly apparent to us, and Mary, you touched on this a little bit in the beginning, is certain systems that we operated in beforehand were challenging to navigate, and now that's just been exacerbated. So for example, for small and medium businesses like ours and our organizations, finding subsidies to hire folks at a meaningful pay is incredibly important. And navigating those systems now has become even more challenging. Like we've learned that a lot of these subsidies were place-based. So if you didn't have a physical job for someone, you can access funding. And
so you're actually, so Linxi, you're actually talking not just about, I think a lot of the focus has been trying for employers to hold on to their existing staff so that they didn't have to lay them off and then they were in, but you're saying, wait a sec, what about the opportunity to hire some new staff? Right?
Absolutely. Right. And we think that time is now, and we've been trying to hire, right? And like, what better time to hire than when tons of folks have been losing their source of employment. And what we've noticed is that not only challenging to navigate the systems that are supposed to support us in hiring these folks, but we're also seeing people that are immensely overqualified just looking for any kind of contract work, because all sectors have been hit, especially the nonprofit and charity sector as well. So we have lots of great people that we would love to support, but the systems that we operate in make it really challenging to provide that meaningful support. Also understanding that we have limited capacity as an organization as well. We're a small staff. We have just like a limited bandwidth. So how can we use that bandwidth effectively to bring people on? So that future of work stuff has definitely been impacted. And I'll speak to just one more point and echo what Veronika said about this homogeneous nature of grouping youth all into one category. What we keep learning through our research and our work is that, first of all, of course, we're not all the same, but it's really interesting in COVID times, for example, we have folks in their 30s who have multiple care obligations. They're caring for their parents and for the young children right now and still trying to do the work. But then we also have folks that are in major life transition of trying to enter university and figuring out, what should I study? I need some practical experience to figure out where I fit into this world.
Yeah.
So there's a really diverse range of experiences and lived experiences that I think we need to take into consideration when we talk about how do we center youth in COVID recovery dialogues.
Yeah, and we've got all these folks coming out of the gig economy, right? So then those precarious,
Yes.
you suggest there's a higher degree of precariousness. Veronika, you said precarity. I can never kind of get that word out, but the idea that there are people who are in precarious employment, and then the gig drives up. So that's true in cultural industries as well, but I bet it's particularly true for your cohort. And then what are the opportunities to get them back? Can I just go back to the chat box and ask, I'm going to tell very specific people, Jennifer, Mohammed, others, you are going to only to panelists, and we really want you to come into everybody. So take your comments. Sadhu, Abdi, same thing. You guys are sending comments only to the panelists. I want you to go to the bottom of your chat column. I can't believe I'm the one instructing you because I'm the least technically sophisticated. Go to the bottom of your chat and change that little toggle switch to all panelists and attendees so that your smart comments can be seen by everybody. Okay, and I see somebody from CUI is trying to remind people to do that too. If you got anything else, Lindsay, do you want to chime in on there, or can I might go to Michael next, okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Is that okay? Okay, Michael, talk to us, Winnipeg. What were you doing before, and what are you seeing for COVID? And then we're gonna come back and pick some of these threads up. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, first of all, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that I'm joining you all from Treaty 1 territory. It's a very beautiful place here, and you mentioned Winnipeg is always snowstorms or mosquitoes, and today it's raining. So look at us and variety. Anyway, here in Winnipeg, the work that I primarily do is as a mentor to young people, a community organizer, and a public speaker. Majority of the work that I do is related to organizing with urban Indigenous young people, First Nations and Métis primarily, but also Inuit. And what we do is we try to encourage young people to connect to existing services or organizations to try to move forward the ideas that they have on city building, on community renewal, on youth empowerment, on leadership development. And so what that's resulted in is Aboriginal Youth Opportunities. And so Aboriginal Youth Opportunities recently was supposed to celebrate our 10th anniversary at a big community gathering, and then COVID-19 came and we were not able to celebrate our 10 years of voluntarily organizing together. But I think it's important to call to attention the fact that there are many young people that don't feel safe or comfortable inside of the existing structures that exist, be they nonprofit, be they municipal. And in these formal structures, a lot of the Indigenous young people that I have connected with, and again, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous young people, and it's important when we're talking about any group, especially Indigenous folks, that we are as specific as possible. So for me, it's primarily young First Nations and Métis folks that have experience living in Winnipeg's inner city and experience living in the child welfare system. Those young people have little faith in cities and in these institutions to actually listen to them, because these groups are over consulted and never reported back to. And then these groups also still have a poorer quality of life than others, despite how frequently they are asked their opinion and how to make things better. And they'll say a million times how to do it, and they will be asked again in a year from another researcher that's disconnected from something else, the same damn questions. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that our structures may be great, but there's a lot of young people that don't feel safe inside of them. And so what are we doing as planners and people that are trying to support young people to connect to those young people that don't feel safe inside of our institutions? So Aboriginal Youth Opportunities has been able to connect young people to one another. And so we've engaged with master's level research in different ways: theology, architecture, community health sciences, but we've also tried to build the capacity of young people to understand systems and system literacy. So we have an initiative that's been going for almost 10 years called Politics Brainstorm, and it's politics spelled with an X, because we're doing politics differently. And it's brainstorms because we want people to bring their brains together and just see kind of what happens with your ideas. And the thing about it is you also have to be smart about marketing and branding. So our hashtag for that is hashtag politics BS, because we're brainstorming, right? And so it becomes important, I think, for us to be responsive to young people, but also flexible. And so politics brainstorms happen in inner city, locally owned restaurants, where young people can take the little dollars that we do have and support the local economy, but also invite people that are a part of these city systems, administrators, and those types of things, to bureaucrats, to come and explain to us city processes, and build our system literacy so young people are better able to understand how processes work and really begin to move forward with something that we feel like is really important to talk about at every level of government and planning, and that's the concept of succession planning. And if you're not succession planning in the work that you're doing, then I don't believe that you're serious about youth.
Right.
So I'll maybe leave it at that.
On that provocative note, can I just, I'll just reassure the chat folks that a number of you are throwing out programs and initiatives and fabulous branding, as somebody just identified for Michael, really great ways that you're packaging these things, and Veronika did as well, and I know that Linxi has as well. So we'll get those in the chat function. We'll dig them up, and the gang here will share with us all these links. So if you're panicking in the audience, they're saying, what was that he said? How do I get that? We'll get that stuff all rounded up for you. I can just say on this business about systems change and then people having a sense of identification, this notion that people didn't know that City Hall is a public building, that is resonating with a lot of people on the chat function. Isn't that just something? That's an interesting symbolic piece, that do people realize what's actually in their public sphere? Okay, let's go to Aaron, and then I'm going to finish with you, Anna. Aaron, talk to us a little bit about your piece of the action here and what you've been before and what you were seeing during COVID.
Right. So I run an organization called Future Majority. We're a youth-led organization where we focus on empowering young Canadians, some millennials and Gen Zs, because one, we feel that our voices aren't being heard in the political process. And then in the 2019 election, for the first time in our generation, there were more millennials and Gen Zs eligible to vote than any other age group. And so for us, it's about taking all of this passive support that young Canadians have. I know we've been having a lot of conversations about the diversity of the needs and concerns of young Canadians, but there's a few things that unify us in which older generations aren't unified. One is it's like close to 90% of us think we should be doing more to take the climate crisis seriously. And clearly our government is not, there's strides that we're doing, but they're not doing enough. A second, and I'll talk about this in a second, is just around access to mental health services. And then just around precariousness of work and employment and affordability, which other folks have talked on. So the way that we go about doing this is we organize young Canadians, not in urban metropolitan areas where by and large, the politicians are like, yeah, we support you, but we focus on suburban, exurban, rural places where there's a huge concentration of young Canadians. And if we just get 1,000 more young Canadians voting in each of these places, none of the political parties can be taken seriously without listening to what young Canadians do. So in the last federal election, we turned out 26,000 students to vote across 15 ridings in Saskatchewan, the 905, and New Brunswick. So that's what we were working on. Right before the COVID crisis hit, we were gearing up to do a really big door-knocking operation in the 905. So we had ambitious goals of picking 10 of the most competitive ridings throughout Ontario, knocking on every single door of an eligible voter and having a conversation with a third of those folks about youth's concerns and building a big volunteer team. Clearly, we're not able to do that. We've pivoted a lot of the work that we're doing to having these conversations online. And I think like everybody in the organizing, business, community, if anyone's going like, we figured it out, here's how we're now moving everything digital, you know.
Yeah.
Right. Well, proof will be in the pudding. But so we're right now we're adapting our model to how to meet young people where they're at digitally and then move them up. I think that some of the things that I think are worth mentioning, we just did a survey process. So before we start any new campaign, we reach out to our top activists and say, these are the policies we're going to work on. What do you think? Would you be excited about volunteering? And the two things that really came back were, one, especially for folks in Ontario, the OSAP, there's already been cuts to OSAP, but the OSAP guidelines, that's the, you know, it's a program that makes post-secondary education more accessible to lower income Ontarians. Doesn't make sense in a pandemic economic crisis. And folks are concerned that, one, post-secondary education and those opportunities are not going to be accessible to those folks with the current guidelines. And then two, like, this is even before there was a pandemic that we were hearing a lot about folks wanting access to mental health services. But people are lonely, they're sad, they're quite anxious about all this uncertainty. And it's, I think this is where it's not about, you know, young Canadians, just take care of yourself, feel better, you know, work out, whatever. Not everyone has these opportunities. This is all about gaps in the social safety net, and mental health being one of them, and something that we can see further being addressed. So that's the first, is that we're seeing those two things. And then just obviously, like, there's nothing I can add. I think everyone here has articulated what's going on with precariousness of employment, work, when are we gonna have income. I think the government's done some really good first steps with the emergency response benefit. Youth unemployment in a regular economy is typically double what the general unemployment is for the country. Just having an unemployment, the emergency response benefits at the end of the summer is not going to be enough for youth and some of the less experienced folks in the workforce who are going to be the ones who are the most difficult to get jobs. So that's my first point. The second is that all of these benefits that are taking place, these bailouts, it's going to be young people who are going to pay for those bailouts with higher taxes, potentially cuts to social assistance, which I hope is not the case, but potentially with higher taxes for the rest of our lives. It's really important that we be part of the process of where are these resources put, and that we're included in that. And a lot of the work we're doing is organizing young Canadians to have their voices heard, because it's going to be our futures where there's potentially the taxes we're paying are going to be paying for that. And then the last thing I want to add is, like, literally this is the opportunity to politicize the half of Canadians who don't vote, who aren't engaged in the political process, who go like, why should I bother? I have a friend from university who, when I saw them in September, had no idea there was a federal election in October. The only thing that they're posting on Facebook is that change.org petition to ban evictions. Every single Canadian understands, not just youth, but Canadian understands why it's important to have the people who have power, who make decisions on if you can go outside, if you can go to work, if you're going to be helped out, really understands why it's important to have that person share your concerns and have your ear. And it's an opportunity to share that message with millions of Canadians who currently don't see a reason to participate.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I want to go right to Anna, and then we're going to start to follow up on some of these things. Anna, talk to us about your ongoing work with the Climate Action Lab. Aaron gave you a brilliant segue about climate. So talk to us.
I know, thank you. I feel like I was left in a hard position to try and bring in new things, because a lot of this has been covered in really articulate way, but I'll do my best, and I do have a few plot twists. Yeah, my name is Anna. I am the co-founder of Youth Climate Lab. We're a Youth for Youth nonprofit, headquartered in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and that's where I'm calling in from. Currently Ottawa. And yeah, we're a Youth for Youth Lab. We're focusing on accelerating transformative climate action. So also in the business of using a lot of buzzwords, but essentially we're trying to really work with young people in policy and entrepreneurship. Policy at the top down, as it has been named quite a few times, ensuring that our voices are being heard right now. And then entrepreneurship on the bottom up approach, ensuring that the tools and resources and funds are available for young people that are innovating and taking action right now. So the reason why I bring all of this, other than self-promotion, is because I do come with a bit of a climate lens, a climate agenda, and then also because what we're trying to accomplish is a just and resilient world. And that's, I think, the two key components that we should be talking about when we're talking about COVID and COVID responses. So touching on some of the things that were said, I want to echo kind of how this has been exposing a lot of the existing problems that we had, how even being part of this conversation is a privilege. Right now, as it was named a lot, young people and everyone really is facing the overwhelming need of finding a summer job, participating in reimagining the economy, learning how to bake bread now. Like, there's just so many things, and at the same time we're dealing with this very traumatic experience, like collectively, that I think it's worth recognizing the tension and like the like burden on mental health that's bringing. And how, again, let me just restate, being part of this conversation of reimagining the new economy is a very privileged space to be, and it's probably already excluding people that were excluded in the first place by not really giving it or making it accessible to really participate in these conversations when you're trying to find ways of meeting basic needs. So that's kind of like my disclaimer. Then I'll continue to echo other things that were said. Youthful is working to make policy accessible at all levels. This was before COVID and now more relevant than ever with COVID. By really working together with intergenerationally. So we're not saying we're going to do it alone. We're saying that we want our voices heard right now with working with people that have access to systems. So an example of that we're making and kind of like pivoting is an infiltration manual. And I have a few folks in this call actually kind of listed to reach out to, but basically we're working with a climate caucus to demystify how local governance works and how before it was focused on climate action, but now it's on interventions that will have an impact on climate, but that are focused on COVID. And how do we make these processes safer, like Michael was naming? How do we make it more accessible and understandable? Where are the gaps, and how can we continue to really make it accessible for all and not just a few? Another thing that was mentioned that I wanted to echo was, the process in itself. I think I already touched on that. Actually, I'm going to skip and introduce a new one, which is climate finance. So Youthful has been working on what we're calling making climate finance youth responsive. So think gender responsive, which is how we've heard about it through government, but really adding a lens to the responsibilities and obligations that finance deployment has on young people. So right now, in this particular case, I think my worry is that we're seeing investments in economic stimulus that are once in a decade, if not more. And we just really need to make sure that these have, I've heard it being referred as green strings attached. I wanna like reframe that and say equity strings attached or just strings attached. Just like a little bit more that like we're not missing the boat. We definitely missed it in 2008 when there was a big economic packages going out to save big companies. So can we do it this time with a focus on people? Can we do it this time in a way that's inclusive, that's bringing not just young people, but all of the traditionally marginalized communities into the conversation? My worry is that we're responding in such a quick manner, which is great, but it's also, I'm hoping we're not missing some of the key components that we have worked so hard to incorporate in these processes so that we can safeguard these structures.
So we'd end up reinforcing what's already there. Go ahead, Anna, last comment, and then we're going to open it up. What were you going to say?
Very last comment, yeah. I just want to throw this in there in terms of, I think what this crisis has also shed some light on is a lot of the formerly impossibles have now been possible. Like it was impossible to have a UBI. It was impossible to stop planes. It was impossible to work
What's
remotely.
UBI?
Universal Basic Income. Universal Basic.
I'm only asking because I just think it's important for us not to use acronyms while we're having these conversations.
and make it more accessible and not privileged. Thank you, Michael. Universal basic income, all of these things that were so many times told to us that it was impossible and that we were not going to see it in our next few years, now are. So how do we maintain that momentum almost and carry those, like, to put it in very simplistic ways, carry the good stuff and like leave the bad stuff behind. So that's my end of echoing and introducing random and new pieces, and I'll open it up now.
So thank you. Thanks all five of you. Terrific ways to get us started. So can we talk a little bit about this notion that there were segments of young people that before COVID felt the city wasn't safe, felt that municipal government wasn't responding to them, felt over-consulted, all that stuff. You've all said it in different, Michael was very specific on it, but you've all said it to a certain extent that you've been working on trying to create new platforms for people to engage, civic literacy, voting, different kinds of avenues. Do you think that COVID is going to usher in a different kind of new set of relationships? In other words, do you think that people are going to they'll have to engage, younger folks, and they'll stay engaged? And will older folks step aside so that can happen? Do you think we can see something stick?
I think the only way that we're going to see that beautiful vision that you just articulated of young people being meaningfully included in planning at a municipal level, the only way that that's possible is if the folks that are currently in those positions of power and influence take the concept of equity into consideration, and also take into understanding the lack of permanence in their own self. People need to understand that as special as they are, they ain't special. And so what I mean by that is we are all replaceable. And so in our systems, we have to build the capacity of the young people around us so that those oldies are able to go off into the world and provide innovation and go into different places. And so I just really feel like it's not going to happen unless some of the control that current power holders have is released. Because I know young people are chomping at the bit in Winnipeg to participate and get involved in municipal processes, but there's often no invitation. There's often no opportunity for them to get in. I know even for me, I muscle my way in to a lot of spaces and then have to like make changes to policies or bylaws or governance documents just to add additional young people to the committee. And I often have to fight people for it because people are humming and hawing saying, oh, confidential, oh, we don't know yet, oh, everything's like a maybe. And so when people are making excuses to not include young people, I don't have faith that they're going to go back to including young people in a meaningful way after COVID, because they didn't do it before.
But there is a window here, eh? I mean, even, leaders, and there's so much that needs to be done and so much thinking that hasn't been done yet, that there is a window for people who've got energy to engage and say, I've got some solutions, right? We do. The question is, can we leverage it? Can we talk a little bit about the pressures that some of you identified? Post-secondary education. That's going to have to change, right? It's going to have to be delivered quite differently. Access to jobs, the things that you were all identifying. I'm interested, not one of you talked about this, but we've heard it for so long. Housing, access to housing. Do you want to go ahead, Linxi? Do you want to jump in on this?
So we've been doing work on the access to employment, but also access to housing bit. And I think there's this, I think we need to identify that precarity of employment is important to discuss, but precarity of housing is also important to discuss. And the reality of housing is not just, can you get a roof over your head and how much does that roof cost? It's also, for young people, what does it look like to navigate roommate relationships during a pandemic and after a pandemic? Yeah. What does it look like to move, to have to re-sign a lease or to move in the midst of all of this? I do think that there's for example, task forces in Toronto on the future of housing and the future of employment. And to speak to Michael's point, it's really interesting because there's a lot of work that has been done that says we need to fix housing for young people because they can't afford a house. But there's not a lot of work that has been done that actually asks youth if they even want to own a house. Maybe we don't want to. Maybe we want to live in a co-op, genuinely. And I think now is the opportunity to leverage and to also advocate for youth to be on those task forces, because lived experience is a qualification, and our voices need to be heard top down, like Anna said, but also bottom up. So advocacy is important, but I also think that we need to have places at these decision-making tables to speak on these issues, because not a lot of people have been asking, absolutely, but now is the time to say, okay, well, we're living through it and nobody understands it better than us. And that is valuable inherently in its own self.
So can we chat a little bit about this? Nobody knows better than us. I mean, I heard in Aaron's comment a little bit of a kind of, they're going to dig us into debt and we're going to have to pay it off over a lifetime. So is there anger about that, folks? Like, and I see some chuckles. I mean, what do you think? Is it, and the question is, will young people engage to figure this out so that in fact you won't be in a situation where you're paying for this for decades, right? What do people think?
I think with regards to that, I think there's the members that we talk to, and that's who I can speak for, is folks are concerned about what's happening right now. Like I had a job for the summer, I don't anymore. Will I be able to,
Right.
and do those sorts of things? The dialogue is not about like it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Folks are worried about their safety needs. They're just like everybody is. And that's, I think, my guess is that if you're pretty set up, you're privileged and you're thinking about like what's happening 6 months to 30 years from now, you're the minority, because most folks don't have that.
Yeah, that perspective. Yeah. Okay, so we've got this whole question about post-secondary and schooling and what's that going to look like. Then we've got a question about, are we going to return to a gig economy? I mean, a lot of young people are employed seasonally, or they cobble together a bunch of different jobs. Do you think there's a way, when we come out of this, there's going to be a lot of stimulus money? Is there some way for young people, I think Linxi was suggesting, have to be at the table making the decisions? Do you think can there be a tipping point moment here where the younger workforce is directly engaged in a certain kind of recovery way? This happened after World War II, guys. That's what happened. There were government initiatives to get servicemen who were coming back and women that were coming back from the war to be educated. There were all sorts of stimulus initiatives that were directed at that point. Do you see anything like that being useful now or appropriate?
Anna, go ahead.
Maybe I can jump in with something that's not my idea. It's a friend of mine, Alyssa, who was talking about how there's going to be a lot of infrastructure investment. This is what we know happens after recession. So how do we incorporate at the city level procurement processes that are ensuring youth employment? So like and this goes back to kind of what we're touching on, which is having youth voices heard right now to make sure that our needs are represented when that happens. But I think there are a lot of mechanisms and types of interventions that cities, municipal practitioners, elected officials can be taking to prioritize parts of the population that may have been deeply affected through this pandemic. I like recognizing that everyone is, but how do we establish, again, is it through procurement? Is it through more resources for wage subsidies, which is what Linxi was talking about? Is it through upskilling and reskilling programs for young people or people in industries that are transitioning? Like, how are we preparing for when that comes? I think is part of that conversation, and engaging in, I'm gonna mix the questions on post-secondary education and future of work, but how are we really preparing for a different economy? We were already talking about that before in the lens of automation and all these other like big factors that are influencing the future of work. We were talking about it from our like climate perspective. Now we're talking about it through this. But how are we preparing the workforce now to make sure that we can access those jobs, and how are systems in place prioritizing access for employment when this is ready?
I mean, we've had suggestions around community benefit agreements. Should there be, I mean, there's a whole question about how construction jobs are allocated. what the relationship would be with unions, with apprenticeship programs, all that kind of thing. Veronika, can you talk to us a little bit about what you've been observing in New York, in Vancouver, around this whole notion of work and housing? You've been under a housing pressure too.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's a large part of it, is that even pre-COVID, I think younger people are more susceptible, are already in a fairly precarious place, having more debt than any generation before, facing huge housing prices, and student and post-secondary costs being higher. And so when a shock like COVID hits, then we're already in a precarious place. And so that shock just lands so much further. And so I think probably what we're observing in Vancouver, I imagine, is quite similar to other cities in that regard, just perhaps that maybe there are more folks who are already in precarious places. And I know that there are also, in terms of all of the support mechanisms that are available now, I think everyone's touched on this a little bit about the complexity of navigating that, but also a lot of gaps in between, and in terms of various roommate situations, and just the question of having a safe place to live as well.
Do you have any, Abigail Slater's asking this on the chat function, do you think there's a chance that young people will leave cities? I mean, there was already a chat about this, that there wasn't affordable places to live, so would they start, but do you, and now of course, some of them are back living with their parents. That might send them away. But do you think there's a chance that this is going to reshuffle this a little bit, that we're going to see younger people making different decisions, more remote working, et cetera? Will they not necessarily congregate and want to be downtown as much? What do people think? Or do you think it's going to stick?
I think in our work, we've already seen folks moving back with their parents, but I think this speaks to Erin's comment about the hierarchy of needs. It's not necessarily a desire to leave the city. It's a survival mode, right? Like, you need to leave. And we've seen lots of folks tell us that it's actually unsafe for them in certain instances to go back into their homes who maybe didn't accept their identities or their lifestyles or whatever it may be before, but now they're forced to go back into those family homes because of the financial instability. Like, we know that pre-COVID, people under 30 had a maximum of, like, I think it was about 60% of people under 30 pre-COVID had only $200 left at the end of the month. Like that, and that was before a pandemic.
So Lindsay, do you think that might stick? Do you think that we might start seeing more intergenerational housing now, just because it's going to take a few years for people to get back on their feet? I mean, we know what about seniors too, that you know, obviously we've got a huge challenge with how we've been caring for infirm folks, older folks who need care, into long-term care facilities, which put them at greater risk. So do you think we're going to see a change in housing size, generally, household size?
I think temporarily, yes. Long term, I'd like to say maybe, but it really depends on, for example, in Toronto, we've seen major changes in the rental market due to Airbnb units not being able to be profitable. So now we have a massive influx of furnished apartments at lower rental prices, which never existed before.
Right.
And now that's making it more accessible in certain neighborhoods for folks to maybe re-access individual housing spaces. So then my question becomes, how does that look like after 6 months? What does Airbnb even exist? What happens with those units? And what kind of rental policies are we going to be supporting at a city level to either facilitate multi-generational housing or more affordable rental access?
And get those back onto the market. And similarly, do you think that we'll see will municipal governments be willing now to consider be more willing to consider accessory units, laneway housing, all these ways that people have been trying to get more intensification? Will we have another window for that?
I also just want to point out that the concept of moving back home, I just want to point out the element of privilege that's in this conversation here, because there are so many community members. I think of the families that I'm working with, of Indigenous young people that are aging out of the child welfare system that don't have that luxury. And so I look at, there have been projects in Winnipeg, like the Winnipeg Street Census, to talk to folks that are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, And the numbers are crazy. 50 to 70% of the folks that are on the streets of Winnipeg have been involved in the child welfare system or themselves are intergenerational survivors of Indian residential schools or the 60s scoop. And so we have to realize that when we're having these conversations, some people don't have a back home. And so it becomes, again, conversations need to be, equity has to be injected into the conversation while we're talking about things like this, because how are we going to shape decision making in the future to support young people, to include those types of voices? I know that for myself, I was involved with the federal government a number of years ago, authoring a report called 13 Ways to Modernize Youth Employment in Canada that talked about the importance of modernizing the workforce. And I think the gig economy is not doing any favors to young people. And I think the labor movement and unions in general really need to give themselves a head shake. I'm from the north end of Winnipeg. That's where the Winnipeg General Strike came from 100 years ago. Right. That changed the face of labor in the world. And so I think what we need is another general strike to make sure that folks know and understand that the goals of the general strike 100 years ago were not actually accomplished, because what they wanted was fair wages for all, safe employment for all, and I don't think we're there. And so,
although you could argue that COVID has put us all in a general strike. I mean, it's sort of, you know, we're sort of all in a general, nature's on a general strike, right? So just in terms of your comment about people not having homes to go to, the other piece, and we're going to run out of time, I could talk to you guys all afternoon, just saying, but about public space. So you're talking about streets, and we all notice it now. Who's on the street? The people that don't have much option to go anywhere else. And what about our public and civic spaces? So do you think that we're going to be able to move? And is anybody seeing examples? I mean, there's improvisation happening where we can make public spaces, streets, parks, community centers. Could they be made safer? Can they be made more welcoming? And can they be adapted in a crisis like this to house people, have a place to go? You know, anybody thinking about that, seeing young people? You know, you're again, not to generalize your cohort, but a lot of experience for young people is in congregate settings together, right? And all of that is going to be different in a socially distanced world. Anybody thinking about that? Sounds like no. You're just all nodding.
I don't think I have any examples or experience to properly answer that question. I do think it is a need and a role for a city to play in making safe spaces for everyone and not just a few. So kind of the theme that we've been talking about in terms of like leaving no one behind. I think right now the level of collaboration between different levels of government is something that can be leveraged to accomplish more of this. So yeah, again, I don't think I'm the best suited to answer that question. Maybe just trying to fill in the silence, but I do think there is an opportunity to kind of collaborate in a way that is truly, with the language of the Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind at the city level.
Mm-hmm. And I think to jump in there, I think when we think about these solutions that we're building, I think there's this thing that when you think about those who are most susceptible to shocks or most vulnerable to shocks and stressors and design solutions, for them, those are actually the most powerful solutions. And I think what I'm most curious about and kind of excited about right now is in part what those solutions are that we're building. What are we learning right now from this time that we can really carry forward? But also what I'm really excited about is how we go about dreaming that new world or reimagining that new future.
So why don't you do a little, I'm going to go around and ask everyone to do what you just did. I'm going to ask you to reiterate that. So if you had one thing, one sticky takeaway thing that you want people who are making big, hard decisions to be aware of, what's the one thing that you think should stick? You just said, I want to hear about what the process is going to be, right? Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I thought I could just throw that out there and that let everybody else paint a picture of what that process is. But I think the key questions are, who are we bringing along and how do we go about doing that in an accessible, barrier-free way, and also a way that centers the lived experiences of those who are most vulnerable to those stresses and shocks. So I think one really tangible way, and I think that this is so important as we think about resilience and think about the solutions and things that we bring forward, is that civic literacy piece. And I think right now, I feel like because of the mass mobilization and change of behavior that we all witnessed overnight, you know, people having to stay home and their whole, well, those of us who are in those positions where we are lucky enough to stay home, but all of society restructuring overnight, I think that sort of mass mobilization has captured people's attentions, and I think that my sense is that younger people are paying attention to government more right now. So I'm curious about how right now we can use that and leverage that in a way to build more of that civic literacy. And I think with some of the examples that Michael gave and other folks gave as well, how we can truly flip the narrative of who has expertise and who should be at the decision-making table, and make sure that younger people understand that those decision-making spaces are for them.
A window, we've got that window. Okay, Aaron, one thought.
Super practical. You need to extend the duration of some of the benefits that are happening. So the emergency benefit for the end of August isn't going to be enough for folks. We're going to need that for longer. And it starts, you know, it starts paving the way to have an idea where we could have something like universal basic income, just generally for people in the country. It'll be much harder to take away those benefits from people if they've had it for 9 months or 12 months than if it was just a summer emergency. And you'll bring in a whole new set of the electorate in the process of serving those people.
Okay, yeah, we have this moment, as we suggested, where people are listening. They have to listen because they need ideas. And there's all this fabulous ideas and generation and people that are paying attention that maybe weren't. So we're generating a big fat cognitive surplus. Let's make sure we don't squander the opportunity, right? Okay, Anna, you next.
A bit of a stakeholder analysis of who's influenced by this decision and who has access to or is impacted by this decision, and who, asking yourself who's not at the table and who's not represented, and why. In the previous economy, the normal, we don't want to go back to that normal. That's only benefiting a few. Like, how are we imagining again, this time with everyone involved? And yeah, just dedicating or being willing to give out some power, which is something that Michael alluded to. But yeah, share your power. It's If you have it right now, see how you can share it.
Share your power, right? This is the big do-over, guys. Okay, 30 seconds to you, Lindsay, and then Michael.
To go off of a little bit of what Anna just mentioned, I'm personally excited about not going back to normal and being very intentional collectively that we do not want to return to what existed before, but we want to use this as a catapult and a trampoline into a better normal, and being very intentional in that process. And I think by reframing that goal, it will help facilitate the inclusion of everybody that needs to be at the tables to help envision that new future.
Got it. Michael, last word to you.
I would say one thing that I would like folks to start doing is to reevaluate the way that you look at city planning at a municipal level. And I want you to think about the way protesting and activism relates to city planning. When folks are active and protesting in community spaces, it means they love and care about that space. And it would be good for folks that are in municipal spaces to listen to the voices of the people that love that land as much as they do, and they're responsible for developing or whatnot. And so in that regard, there's a reference. Jason Civicsay is a city planner, pretty known across Canada, who does amazing work. He has a master's thesis he did with me and some community members in Winnipeg called Where They Meet, Indigenous Activism in City Planning in Winnipeg. It's a reference that I think people should take a look at because there are some important findings there about how to bring equity into your city planning processes.
Great. Okay. Well, again, as I said, we'll try to post as many of these links that you guys, and we'll count on you to send us notes so that we get the links right, and we'll get those up on the chat, and we'll make them on the blog available too. So thank you, folks, very much. Aaron, Veronika, Michael, Lindsay, and Anna for joining us and giving us we sometimes call these sessions wake-up calls, you know, that it's a wake-up call for how we're actually living it together in urban environments, and what do we need to extract and learn best as we come through this extraordinary time. So thank you very, very much for adding your insights and your experience and your gut checks and all the questions you've raised. Great to have you. As we say, the conversation is only beginning. Please continue on the chat if you like. Come back to City Talk onto the blog, you'll see more comments there, and Twitter away at #CityTalk. We're really keen to have this conversation continue. Later this week on Thursday, we do another candid conversation. It's on municipal finance and how our municipality is going to actually fund all the services and the programs that we all rely on to make our lives work. What is that going to look like going forward, as they are extraordinarily overstretched? Were before and now really overstretched, as everyone knows. So we're going to talk to some folks about how are we going to pay for all this, just in the short term, not even the generations, the decades that this group was referring to, but just in the shorter term. And then on Friday, we have a one-on-one with Mayor Mike Savage, the mayor of Halifax, who is dealing with extraordinary challenges. He already was, and now they've had that tragedy from 10 days ago, still reeling from that. But let's hear from him about how municipal government, and particularly the city of Halifax, the region, and the region around him are responding in imaginative ways to what's ahead for them. So thanks everybody for joining us in City Talk, and particularly thank you to this gang for raising all the issues that are important to young people. Thanks again, very, very much. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks.